Yeah. Just my take on things. My answer to number 2. Guide discovery. Identifying, challenging your beliefs. Reframing your mind, negative thoughts release.
All right. Welcome to the next episode of Peplau's Ghost. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate you sacrificing a little bit of your holiday vacation, maybe, or depends on when you're listening to this. But thank you. Appreciate you listening to us. I am really excited to have our wonderful guest, my esteemed colleague, Dr. Barbara Peterson from the University of Minnesota. So really excited to get into a conversation with her. And I am joined with my further esteemed colleagues, Dr. Sean Convoy from Duke University, Kate Melino from the University of California, San Francisco, and Melissa Chapman Hayes, who is, again, our program evaluator, who very much provides graciously making sure that we don't get too jargony, basically. So let's do a quick introduction for Dr. Barbara Peterson. As I mentioned, from the University of Minnesota, you are a full clinical professor, which is always impressive from my point of view. You are the PMHNP clinical coordinator, so you've been doing that for a while. You are also the director of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is, again, very impressive. You are a fellow in the National Academy of Practice. You got that in 2021, which I didn't know much about, to be quite honest, but always impressed with fellows. But that is an organization with 15 different health professions, and so really emphasizes interprofessional work together. So one of the things I definitely want to highlight and really kind of shine a light on is that you are the current president of the International Society of Psych Nurses. Full disclosure, if I haven't mentioned that on the podcast at this point, I am the president-elect. So that is one of the reasons that Barb and I are definitely here on this call. So I'm really excited to maybe talk a little bit more about that. I see definitely you have a lot of specialization in working with children and adolescents. So hopefully we'll get into talking about that and how you provide psychotherapy for that population, which is very specialized in my opinion, and would love to kind of learn a little more from you on that as well. So also multiple publications, just very impressed on the website, all the publications, various topics on DEI, interprofessional work, and children and adolescent, of course. So, and then also multiple federal grants, saw a couple HRSA grants in there too. So again, all very impressive. So thank you again, Dr. Barbara Peterson, for joining us. If you've said you've listened to a couple episodes, so you know kind of the first question I'm going to ask, do you remember the first time that you and I met?
Yeah. Oh, when? I forgot about that question. I'm so pleased to be here, Dan. I really appreciate you asking me, and I'm nervous, but I'm excited to be here. So yeah. When did you and I meet? I think it was at NOMF.
Yes.
And I think you were giving a lecture on, well, I'm not sure if you were giving a talk on maybe child bipolar. I'm not 100% sure. But yeah, and then we sort of followed each other around at different psych mental health conferences through ISPN, through APNA. And so wherever I was, there you were as well. So yeah.
That's what I remember too. It was a NOMF conference. So it was, and I remember us meeting kind of in the hallway. You were very gracious with me and definitely want to say thank you because you mentioned this is always one of those things that I don't know why we keep this so secret, but you were supportive of my promotion from assistant to associate professor. And so mentioned that was one of those things that you were supportive of and really impressed with my work. So again, little old me didn't really know much, and you to come up and say thanks. I always really appreciate that. So thank you, Barb, for that. Yeah. So I guess the first quote unquote serious question for the podcast is, when did you first get interested in doing psychotherapy?
Yeah. So, I'm an old clinical nurse specialist, and so in part of my education as a clinical nurse specialist, a foundational piece of it was psychotherapy as one of the pillars that the advanced practice psychiatric nurse does. And so that's when I got interested in it from a professional point of view. I had in a number of times have been in therapy experiences myself for my own work that I've done, but I hadn't seen it from the professional point of view until I did my CNS. And that was in 1998. I graduated with my clinical nurse specialist degree from the University of Minnesota. And one of my professors was such an excellent educator about psychotherapy, Dr. Mary Koss. And through the years, much of her practice has incorporated individual therapy for a number of her patients as well as med management. So she was a great example for me. Yeah. So it's been a few years. Yeah.
Awesome. Dr. Peterson, I'll first start off by saying I'm also a mature clinical nurse specialist as well. So I share that with you. And I love asking this question, particularly of CNSs, because I think the answer is as unique as a fingerprint. So can you recall like a galvanizing clinical experience for you that kind of sets the stage for your use of psychotherapy in the future? Like, was there something that happened in clinical practice that said, yes, I have lightning in a bottle here?
Yeah. I never really saw psychotherapy as lightning in a bottle that I did, because I felt like I was just scratching the surface. And so I would be around other therapists who were doing it full time and be in awe at their understanding of the psychodynamics that are going on in the patient. And I remember in my first clinical practice after graduating, listening to therapists who really had such depth and learning from them, and then trying to sort of emulate that. So I was a fairly new CNS, and I was seeing adults as well as children. And I had one patient that I did a combination of med management and therapy with this patient. And, she had OCD and really was struggling with her obsessive compulsive disorder. That's what OCD is. And she was really struggling with it. And I remember working with her. I wasn't a formal therapist in OCD, but I was learning as I went. And we would go on walks outside and talk about what it was that her fears were and how she was able to manage those fears as we were walking and talking. I just loved that. And it was also out of the box, right? Going outside for therapy. That was pretty cool. And then one time as a new psych specialist, I had a patient who was part of a family, and they wanted family therapy. And that was such an awful experience. I came into it as, having done homework about family therapy and having learned about it. But when we got into that room, I knew right away that I was out of my depth. As graciously as I could, I kind of extracted myself from that and brought in somebody who actually knew what they were doing. So those are a couple of memorable times in the early years when I was doing therapy.
That's fantastic. I commonly share with my students that, when it comes to developing your psychotherapy skills, sometimes you feel like you're assembling the plane while you're flying it. And it sounds like that's kind of what you were talking about, right?
Exactly. That is so true. And, you have your didactic education about it. You have your clinical experience with it in school. You're watching other people do it. But man, until you're in that chair, you don't know anything.
It reminds me too of, kind of a saying, like when we raise children, we forget that the parents are growing up at the same time too, right? I mean, we are maturing, as we have children and growing up as well. So it's the same idea. I think there's that dynamic where we watch our clients grow, but we also grow in that process too. So thanks. I think Kate has our next question.
Yeah. So Dr. Peters, I'm really curious, what forms or types of psychotherapy are you most drawn to? And if you can say a little bit about why.
So as my career has unfolded, I work primarily with children and adolescents, as Dan said. And I also work primarily, I have my clinical practice in a federally qualified health center, FQHC. So we see all patients regardless of their immigration status, regardless of their ability to pay. And so many of the patients who I see, the kids, children, and adolescents that I see have pretty significant trauma history, whether it's through immigration or refugee experiences that they've had, or housing insecurity or chronic poverty, bullying, patients who I mean, parents who have been incarcerated, just a ton of family, community, school traumas that they carry around with them. And then they come, and then they are identified then as having a problem and, which is usually some kind of behavioral problem in school where they're not functioning, they're having outbursts, stuff like that. And so then they come in to see me, and most of the time they think they're coming in to see me for strictly meds. The parents are coming in and the teachers want them to come in because they want the kid to be fixed. And the first thing they think about is this kid needs to be on meds, which many times that's true. But what I'm seeing with what's really easy to see is that underlying some of the behaviors is that trauma experience that they've had. That's the kind of thing that isn't going to be fixed with any pill, right? And so through working with kids who have trauma experience, my focus has been on working with their trauma responses that they have. So whether it's trauma focused CBT, which I'm not a certified CBT person, but I understand the concepts enough to know that I better be including this in my sessions with kids. If I don't, I'm really not hitting what the driver is of their behaviors. So I also do play therapy where we just play, and a big believer in mind-body therapies. It's because we know that trauma lives in the body, right? And so when a person gets triggered or is overreacting or something like that, it's because trauma is residing in their body. And so to get to that trauma, a lot of times we need to do the work with the body, right? So, I've got breathing balls and stress balls, and I do something called Yoga Calm. It's a therapy technique for children with trauma. Our whole clinic learned it, Yoga Calm, about 7 or 8 years ago. And it's kind of this physical approach to yoga that we can incorporate right in our offices, right? And so we do stuff like that. Yeah.
That's so incredible. I think for so many reasons. I mean, one is that, it's been a bit of a through line and throughout our episodes that there is a tension between these sort of more high volume FQHC type settings where psychotherapy is not necessarily promoted in the same way that med management is. And you're making sure that you are able to do that. And then also with this population who often doesn't get access to this kind of treatment. So that's incredible.
Yeah.
My follow-up question is, I'd love to know how you see nursing maybe being a leader in performing psychotherapy, perhaps specifically with these populations you're working with.
Yeah. Okay. I love that question. And before going to that question, Kate, could I kind of respond about what you said about FQHCs?
Yeah.
Because I think that's really true, that our industry, the industry of psych mental health for children, doesn't automatically offer that for prescribers, right? The industry sees us as prescribers. Yet in our FQHC, we have 30-minute visits, follow-up visits. I can do a med management follow-up in 12 minutes, right? I mean, when it comes down to it, sometimes it takes longer than that if you're titrating, if you're doing all that stuff. But a lot of times that's not what the crux of our time needs to be in a 30-minute med management visit. And so whether I can bill for it, because I can't bill for it in an FQHC, I can't bill for therapy. We have therapists who bill for therapy, but whether I bill for it or not, I still have 15 minutes, which isn't very long. But when you're working with a kid, that's about all they can tolerate. And me, that's about all I can tolerate too, because my, attention span isn't that great either. I think what's really an important message is the incorporating what we know with our therapy, that we know that it is a really important tool and combine that with what everybody expects us to do, which is to manage their medications. Anyway, so yeah. Well, I think maybe that's it. Maybe that's how advanced practice nurses can be a leader in this, is stand up to the industry expectation that we're just there to prescribe meds, right? And say no, because as a nurse, I'm more than somebody who can write a prescription. I'm more than that. And my relationship with the patient is more than that, right? And we as nurses, we know that, right? I mean, we know that the relationship is at the core of every kind of treatment, whether you're a medical nurse or psychiatric nurse, we know that the relationship is core. And so if we're not really getting to that core, then we're not really treating the patient. I also tell students this when our students are ready to graduate and we talk about them interviewing and we talk about who do you want to be? Where can you practice? Where you can be who you want to be, right? As a psych NP. And so there will be plenty of clinics who will say, we want you to do 15-minute med checks or something like that. Do you want that for your practice? You'll make a ton more money, right? But do you want that? And students, I think, are still idealistic, right? About how they're going to shape their practice. And it takes a couple years for the industry to beat them down. So I think that's something that the nurses can do, right? Is to say, no, I want this for my practice. And
Preach,
anyway.
Barb, preach. Keep going. No, that's awesome. That's great.
Sorry.
I think we're all getting the tingly feelies here. That's great. Thank you. No, that's awesome.
I'll
Thank you.
kind of, I do get a little worked up.
No, I love it.
This is what we need to hear. Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Melissa's got the next question, but yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, I wish we if we could capture the nonverbals in this podcast, there would be a lot going on right then.
Oh.
But kind of the flip side, are there any concerns about PMH nurses using psychotherapy? Is kind of the flip of what Kate asked.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that the nurse needs to know what they know and they need to know what they don't know, right? And they need to know what their skills are and what they haven't developed yet. So I think getting out of your depth is a really big problem, right? And if you don't know that you're out of your depth, then you could do some damage. You could be steering a person into areas that could potentially be actually re-traumatizing for them, right? Or can bring them into areas that lead to really unhealthy choices for them if you don't know what you're doing. So I think it's important for psych nurses to know their depth and to know when they're getting out of it. Yeah, Sean, in the chat, you wrote something about Johari's window. That is so true. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Johari's window is this great little tool that we actually train our students with to kind of get them to distill what they know, right? So we know that there are known knowns, there are known unknowns, there are unknown knowns, and there are unknown unknowns. And our ability to kind of map out our blind spots as clinicians, right? Because we recognize the brand new, fresh off of the training pipeline psych nurse practitioner doesn't have the same knowledge, skills, and attitudes that, say, somebody who, like us who have been trained for decades, or a psychiatrist who's got 10,000 hours under their pocket before they get out to board certification. We have to train students to pay attention to Johari's window to recognize their unknown unknowns, because that's what gets patients in trouble and that's what gets clinicians in trouble.
Oh, well said. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that.
I remember too, I mean, even back in the days when I was trained as a social worker, there's unfortunately, and I think, and I appreciate you, Barb, bringing this up. I mean, it's unfortunately therapists get in these, I call them a blotter, but it's basically they get published for, public, remediation or reprimands and things like that, because, I'll just say it bluntly, unfortunately, sometimes therapists have sex with their clients, which they shouldn't. And I think that's right. Once you don't appreciate that countertransference and other issues and get triggered with your own stuff, if you don't have that appreciation, that's where you get into that. And, and obviously if you talk to people who get in those kind of things, they didn't start off that way. They don't kind of head down that road, but they get in a place where they just don't feel like they can back out of it at that point. So
yeah, that's right. And that's why consultation supervision is so critical, right? And most therapists build that into their practice. They build in case consultation and supervision into their practice, which will help them identify the countertransference issues that they might be experiencing, or ways that they're going out on a limb where they into dangerous territory. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've got the next question, and I'm going to kind of go off script a little bit, and I'll let Sean save the last question for you. But I would really like to just know, just kind of, really tap your wise wisdom here. And, whenever I work with children and adolescents, probably the biggest challenge is just those first few sessions. How do you connect with that kid? How do you get that kid to start to believe in you, start to trust you, so they can actually open up and start sharing some of those traumatic experiences like you were talking about for? Do you have any kind of, and again, I don't mean to try and pare down your massive experience and wisdom to, just a few sentences, but do you have any kind of strategies that you kind of go to? Like, what are your go-tos to kind of connect with a kid?
That's a great question. Two things pop into my mind. First of all, it's the recognition that all behavior has meaning. So for kids, they're maybe not able to give voice to their feelings, but they do that through their behaviors, right? And so that my knowing that searches for meaning and connections, right? Connecting behavior to what those emotions might be, right? So that's kind of foundational for me. Okay. So that I think is very solid. The other thing that I really believe is that you have to like them, and liking them is not something that is always easy. And it is a very intentional choice. What is it that I like about you? And let them know, and let down the highly professional, all buttoned up way that we approach some people, and let that down and show them and find things that you like about them, right? You know what? Pretty much anybody can do that. That's a choice, right? We don't need extra specialized training to choose to like the kids that we work with, right? So I think that's kind of, and I do think that they know that, right? They know that. Because a lot of kids that I have, they're not very well liked. Their parents find them annoying. They're always in trouble with their teachers, and they're getting bullied, right? So there's a lot of spaces in their lives when they're not very well liked, and they know that, and that sucks for them. So that's a biggie, I think. Yeah.
So Barbara, you're talking Carl Rogers to me. You're giving me some unconditional positive regard vibes, and I'm absolutely loving it. So I have to kind of declare that.
Thank you for bringing up. That's the underpinning, right? Is Carl Rogers' unconditional positive regard for the folks that we work with. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that.
I love it. So one of our not so implicit goals here, it's actually really explicit with the podcast, is to kind of put some wind in the sails of psychotherapy for advanced practice nurses, right? So, I'm thinking right now as it relates, you talked earlier about the idea that there's a lot of market drivers that are pushing us away from financial reasons, right? And in many regards, I almost feel like we're in a Robert Frost poem, that we're, two roads diverged in a wood, and we have to make a decision about where we go. So as you think about this, what do you see as the future for psychotherapy, specifically for advanced practice psychiatric mental health nursing?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because we do have the strong market, but we also, what I've seen in Minnesota, we have independent practice here. Once the person graduates and gets a full year of experience under their belt. And what I have seen more and more is psych NPs who are dropping out of the big systems, healthcare systems, and finding other ways of practice, like aligning themselves with practices where it's been traditionally only therapy. And now they've got one, and now they've got two psych NPs who work with the therapists, or they're opening up their own businesses with their own business model that they want to adhere to. And then other psychiatric nurses, APRNs, NPs are coming into those practices. So I think that that's kind of voting with your feet, right? That those folks are voting on this whole topic with their feet. And that's really exciting for me to see that happen. And they're also examples of, and it's not just the old folks like me, but it's folks mid-career, right? Early to mid-career who are saying, I am going to be freaking burned out in another year if I keep at this pace, right? And they're making a choice, and a really bold and brave choice, to move to a different practice that aligns with really what. So is that the future, or is that just my wish? I'm not sure. Right. But that's what I hope will continue, and what I have seen really happen in Minnesota.
What I hear from you is it almost seems like there's some purposeful system disruption that's taking place. We have to kind of shake the status quo. Fair to say?
Fair to say. More than fair. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think if we get enough dynamic going in that direction, maybe that'll have a feedback loop on itself, right? The more people going out and doing that entrepreneur or private practice type of model, then the organizations will be like, we don't have anybody to run our clinic, so we need to kind of bring these people. How do we bring these people back? Well, we listen to them and listen to their model of care that drove them away, and so maybe that's maybe a lot of hope I hear. So yeah. Thank you again, Dr. Barbara Peterson. We've very unfortunately, we've come to the end of this podcast. I'm hoping we've gotten a little bit of your anxiety down. I will say I heard a little bit of your Minnesota accent coming out. So I think that, you're getting more comfortable. So, but very much appreciate sharing all your thoughts and wisdom here. Thank you for listening, those out there in whatever space and listening to Peplows Ghost. We look forward to having another episode posted soon, but thank you very much for listening. Take care.
All right. Thank you.
Personalization, overgeneralization, global labeling, emotional reasoning. Too much thought like this, too much seasoning. They feel it, therefore it's true. Work hard until those thoughts are finally leaving, so you can be you. They feel it, therefore it's true. Work hard until those thoughts are finally leaving, so you can be you. Guided discovery. Identifying, challenging your beliefs. Reframing your mind, negative thoughts release. Let it go. These cognitive distortions decrease until they cease. Yeah, guided discovery. Identifying, challenging your beliefs. Reframing your mind, negative thoughts release. Let it go. These cognitive distortions decrease until they cease.